Professor Cyril Hovorun. Just a little introduction to you, if I may. So Professor Hovorun is also an archimandrite of the Orthodox Church, which needs some explanation. If I've understood it rightly, Cyril, it's someone who has a monastic background who's taken the priesthood. Is that right?
Well, somehow in the modern terms, it's rather post-monastic, I would say. But yeah,
Post-monastic.
Historically, you're right.
I was wondering. You didn't strike me as a monk.
He's a senior unmarried priest.
Right. Okay. So, but you've held senior positions in both the Ukrainian and the Russian Orthodox churches. You're professor of international relations, ecclesiology, and ecumenism at the St. Ignatius Seminary in Stockholm, Sweden. You're in Ukrainian yourself. You first studied physics in Kiev, and then theology, moved on to the University of Athens, and finally Durham, where you pursued your PhD, supervised by none other than Professor Andrew Louth. So there's a strong bond between you. Your academic experience is even more global than that, ranging from Canada to China. As visiting professor and lecturer in many places. Your research fellowship was at Yale and Columbia in the United States, and you have published several books in various languages. Just to mention one, if I may, which I think is particularly relevant to our seminar today. I can pop it on the screen. This is your book on political orthodoxies, the unorthodoxies of the church coerced, and this really sums up the whole thing. Which, if I were to try to summarize it, not only would it take too long, but I think probably in the course of what you have to say about political religion, which is really your subject, against the background of what's happening in Ukraine, it would be much better to hear it from yourself. So very delighted to have you with us, and may I hand over to you now for the next half hour, and then we'll have questions and discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be with you here in this distinguished group. And also thank you to Father Andrew for his introduction. I think it was really helpful. And just on top of that, I may say that if Patriarch Kirill and the Russian Church to be judged by the social doctrine of the Russian Church, adopted in 2000, they would not stand a chance, to be not judged, and even condemned by that. So there is a contradiction, discrepancy between the text of the document and the deeds by those who had drafted the document, including Kirill. Kirill was the main driving force behind that document. And he has contributed largely to this war, theologically and rhetorically. And it's interesting, we are observing, I think, an interesting phenomenon when Putin has become a sort of theologian. In the recent statements that he made and addresses to the public in Russia, he made some theological statements, in the words of Father Andrew, of dubious orthodoxy. Indeed, particularly with the reference, for example, to the debates in the Anglican Church, he wanted to condemn, the debates about whether the gender-specific language is applicable to God, and he ended up essentially by claiming that God has a gender. Apparently, in Putin's mind, he's a male figure. So it's one of the recent statements. Essentially, it's interesting. It's indicative of an interesting phenomenon that we're observing, that Putin seems to lack, rational, political, or social, whatever, explanations of the war, and he sleeps somehow, ends up in explaining the war metaphysically or even theologically. He does it clumsily. But the fact that he tries to do it theologically, it's indicative. It means that this war cannot be explained, rationally or politically anymore. It can be explained only, well, explained, if it is explainable at all, metaphysically, at least put in tries. And Patrick Kirill helps him in trying, but not just Patrick Kirill. And the topic of my presentation will be about how some other people in the Russian church help Putin to explain the war by using biblical texts.
Your sound has gone.
Sorry.
You're back again.
Since our since our seminar is on the biblical theology, so let me do some. Let me showcase some instances of a biblical theology supporting the war. First, what I want to mention is other witnesses coming from the Moscow Theological Academy. The Moscow Theological Academy is the main theological institution of the Russian church. It's really the power plant, theological power plant. The majority of the bishops of the Russian church have graduated from the Moscow Theological Academy, and it's still like the most important place to do theology in the Russian church. And it's remarkable that it has become the main producer of the pro-war theology, including biblical theology, which is really scary. For example, the former rector of the Moscow Theological Academy, Bishop Peterim Tvorogov, who is now a bishop in Ryazan region in Russia, but well, he served as the rector of the Moscow Theological Academy for 1 year, short period of time, but he left legacy, so to say, and he actually taught rhetorics, homiletics in the Moscow Theological Academy. I'd like to bring your attention to his recent masterpiece of his homiletics. That's a sermon that he delivered recently in his diocese. Let me share with you just a spot of it. Just 1 sec, and I will share with you the screen. It is. I hope you can see it, right?
Yes.
Can you hear him?
Not yet.
Not yet, sorry. Then I will need to just 1 sec. Yeah. Okay, it may take some time. Anyways, he speaks in Russian. I'll explain you what he's talking about. So he started his homily by stating, "We gathered here to fervently pray for the victory." Then he referred to his trip to Donbass, together with his priests from the diocese. He said that at the front line, he felt, I quote him, "a special grace of God." In his words, he hasn't felt such a grace anywhere else, including Mount Athos or Holy Land. Peterim continued building his sermon on counterposing the criminals who have been recruited, as you probably know, by the Wagner Group. So the Wagner Group is like a private military company. They recruit prisoners from the Russian prisons, and they brought them to the front line. So Peterim encountered them on the front line from the Russian side in Donbass. And he explained that he counterposes those prisoners, criminals who fight, for Russia in Ukraine, with those who criticize the war on the other side. So the former, the prisoners for Peterim, are saints. He uses the word saints, while the latter are worse criminals and sinners. He acknowledges that the Russians are represented by some Ukrainians, kind of explained by some Ukrainians as Cains, with a reference to the son of Adam. In response to such an accusation, Peterim describes who is the Abel then. It is the Ukrainians. Well, if the Russians are the Cains, the Ukrainians are the Abels, well, in the Ukrainian interpretation at least. And Peterim addresses this interpretation. So he says that effectively, Abel is a neo-Nazi. Imagine, in the vein of the Russian propaganda. In his interpretation, in Peterim's interpretation, in reality, the Ukrainians are the collective Cain, while the Russians are a collective Abel. Well, it seems that it's the Ukrainians who kill mostly the Russians just innocent victims in Peterim's interpretation. He asks the question, if we are Cain, as the Ukrainians present us, Russians, why then do we have such a grace? Why there are miracles on the Russian front lines? So his main point is that the miracles happen, the saints are there, they are Russians, therefore they are Abels, and the Ukrainians are Cains. Peterim acknowledges, however, that the Ukrainians can also have miracles. So he interprets, the war in the terms of miracles. Who has more miracles? Who has more? Those who have more miracles for Peterim are they are the allies of God, so to say, or God is their ally. And he asserts that the Russians have more miracles on the front line than the Ukrainians do. And he believes that the Russian miracles, so to say, are more powerful than the Ukrainian ones. Peterim also speaks about Satan as the main cause of the biblical fratricide. For him, the West plays the role of the Satan in the Ukrainian war. So he essentially projects, the biblical story about the fall, the Satan, Abel and Cain to the Ukrainian war, and gives his own interpretation of the war in the light of these stories. The ostensibly evil role of the West is the focus of another prominent figure from the Moscow Theological Academy. So now I move from Peterim to another more serious guy from the academy. That is the professor of the Moscow Theological Academy, Alexei Ilyich Osipov. He's quite famous. He's very popular speaker. His recordings are really popular in the among the Russian believers, and he's like a celebrity, so to say, in the church environment, at least in the Russian church. In November 2022, in a TV interview for the channel Spas, which is Savior, owned by the Russian Orthodox Church. So this Spas channel has become the main propagator of the war, and they invite people like Osipov to talk. So in one of the interviews to the Spas channel, Osipov assured, and I quote him, I have no doubt that there is a cult of Satan in the West. Apparently, all the leaders of the Western states participate in it. Only the members of such satanic association can become leaders in the West. So that is his assertion, end of quote. In Osipov's interpretation, the satanic West forced Russia to the war. In an earlier statement, he explained that, and again I quote him, those steps that Russia has taken now, that is to engage in the war in Ukraine, are necessary. Thank God that it managed to launch the war at the last moment when everything was already hanging over the abyss. So essentially, in Osipov's interpretation, it was the Ukrainians, in Peterim's word, the Cains, who first wanted to launch the war against the Russians to kill their brother, the Abels, the Russians, and the Russians in the last moment, reversed this evil plan of the West and started this war against the Ukrainians. Moscow Theological Academy has a department of biblical studies, which is pretty good from my experience, because I taught in the Moscow Theological Academy for some time and know quite a few people from there. I should say that it's used to be a good department, quite solid one. It particularly flourished under the leadership of Father Leonid Griliches, who led it from 2004 through 2012. Then he left the Moscow Theological Academy. He moved to Belgium, and he's now a priest in the Rokor, Russian church outside Russia. And his position was taken over by some other people, like a friend of mine. We were friends in the past. Now of course, we have very different positions. Father Alexander Timofeyev, he actually runs this they call it the chair of biblical studies. He was in the biblical archaeology. He went to Israel for many times, like he participated in excavations and so forth. And now he goes to Donbass primarily, not to Israel, but to Donbass to support the Russian troops. And he also publishes a lot on his experience, and tries to justify this war now from the biblical perspective. On his social media, he heroicizes the Russian military and presents Ukrainians as a Nazi regime. a graduate of the Moscow Theological Seminary and now the rector of the parish of Gimo. This is the main academic, diplomatic academy in Russia, like the Institute of International Relations, which is the main place where the Russian diplomats are trained in Moscow. So there is a parish there, a community there, which is led by a priest who is a graduate of the Moscow Theological Seminary, Father Igor Fomin. He has developed his own theology of war and theodicy, of violence, based on the Bible. He deliberates on them in an episode from the documentary series War and the Bible, produced by the mentioned church-owned channel Spas. The series is based on the book by the Serbian bishop Nikolai Velimirovich with the same title. So Velimirovich wrote the book called War and the Bible, where he tried to rationalize the war, from the biblical perspective, and attempt to produce a kind of just war theory from the biblical perspective. And it's, I think, it has been translated into English and published actually by the Diocese of New Grachanitz and Midwest America in the United States in 2018, the English translation. So you may check out this book. It's an interesting piece of kind of war reflections on the war from the biblical perspective. So I'd like to focus on episode 5 from the series, which is titled "For Which Reason Did God Condemn the Biblical Cities to Death?" This episode focuses on the biblical story told in the book of Joshua. It's chapter 24 from Joshua, and I quote, "And you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho, and the leaders of Jericho fought against you, and also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivitites, and the Jebusites, and I gave them into your hand." So this quote from Joshua was taken, by the producers of this documentary and applied to the war in Ukraine. Let me briefly show you, share again. I'll try to show a piece of this documentary to give you an impression. They will talk to each other in Russian, but you will see the scenery and it's talking itself. Just give me a second, and I'll be happy to do it. Right now. Just 1 second. Here we go. Yeah, now I can do it. And I think now I can do it with the sound. Can you see and hear it?
We hear it, we see it, but not hear it yet.
Yeah, it's yeah, these two guys. So it's this priest is Father Fomin. He is this rector of the parish community in Gimo. He meets the producer from the Spas channel, Korchevnikov. Korchevnikov is like an Orthodox journalist, and they put together this documentary and they discuss the idea of war on the basis of the Joshua, the book of Joshua, and they met in Volnovakha, the eastern Ukrainian city in Donbass. You see, they are kind of protected with icons on the helmets and with the emblems of the Spas TV channel owned by the Russian church. And they have a very interesting discussion, which I'd like to really to analyze a bit. So what they're talking about. As I said, this episode has been recorded in Volnovakha. This city was almost completely destroyed, demolished by the Russians. And actually, they show the ruins of the city, those two guys, and they explain why those ruins are possible, why they have happened. And Father Igor Fomin, this priest with a beard, he mentions that, and I quote him, "God gives a direct command to the Jewish people to cleanse the land from the peoples. that were impious and therefore destined by God to go into oblivion, so that other peoples could be erected in their place. So they make this reference to the biblical story about the elimination of the people who lived in Palestine to kind of liberate the space for the Jewish people. And he draws a parallel between Volnovakha, Donbass, and Palestine. So he says that essentially God liberates, cleanses those lands, now to give this land to another people, more pious one, the elected one. One asks the question, how can God, who loves mankind, wants his people to perish even if they are impious? So the Ukrainian are impious, and how God, who is love, can punish them. Father Fomin answers, God does not think in the categories of human life. This is a liberal way of thinking. In contrast to it, God does not have limitations, even when it takes to take the life of a whole people. He does not hesitate to eliminate the peoples when they apostatize from him. When Father Fomin was saying these words, the editors of the film show the pictures of a gay couple blessed by a priest somewhere in the West. So essentially, he says that the apostasy, it applies not just to the Ukrainians, but the entire West. And the Ukrainians are the first to be punished by God. So essentially implies that the West, the decadent West, will come next. Yes, although Father Fomin does not explicitly say that the same applies to the Ukrainian people, he implies it because, and the editors of the movie made it very smart. During those discussions about the biblical story about Palestine, they showed the pictures from Ukraine. Footages from Ukraine, including, like, for example, the Revolution of Dignity in the Maidan in Kiev in the days in the years 2013 to 2014. And the message of the documentary is very clear. The Ukrainians revolted against God when they turned against the regime of Viktor Yanukovych, for which reason God sent the Russian army to punish them. Father Fomin asserted that the chosen people of Israel stopped to be chosen when they abandoned Christ. That is a popular trope, of this sort of theology. In a similar way, according to the film's narrative, the Ukrainians lost God's mercy after they chose to abandon the Russian world. So there is a parallel, the Ukrainians who apostatize from the Russian world and the Israeli people who apostatize from Christ. And therefore, well, the Ukrainians are punished by the punishing hand of God, the Russian army. And they don't say it, but they imply a very dangerous thing, I think, that that Nazis were a similar punishing hand of God. Therefore, it can be justified, Shoah, Holocaust. The Jewish people died because they were punished for apostasy, and they were punished by God. And essentially, even though their entire Russian propaganda is against Nazi, they accuse the Ukrainians of being neo-Nazi. Essentially, they imply that you can justify the Nazis because they played this role of the punisher from God for apostasy, for betraying God. I think this message is really dangerous. The message that comes from this movie, if it goes this way, you can justify the worst things in the world, and that's exactly the sort of biblical theology they try to produce. They try to apply to the Ukraine situation, and I think this is something that needs to be really addressed, seriously and stopped theologically and in other way, because it may lead us, really to very dangerous turf. That's what I wanted to share with you. And again, let me show you a couple of maybe seconds of this footage, just to give an idea of the atmosphere of this documentary. Again.
эти ханаанские народы. И Господь как будто предчувствовал, что Он может дать слабину в какой-то момент. И Иисус,
They're
наверное,
shooting
он и
somewhere in
народ
the
пока,
background.
и
And then,
военачальнику и так далее. Там они шли победной поступью по Святой Земле. Эти народы, эти народы погибали, как и поручил Господь. Но как только появлялось малодушие, грех, и какое-то сразу тормозилось, как кто-то начал думать, что нет, наверное, не будет.
Well, this is interesting. It's like a
Разные
destroyed.
другие
You
потрясения.
see, a
У каждого
destroyed
народа есть
infrastructure.
своя миссия
They also show
в мире.
tanks,
И для того,
Russian
чтобы вот
tanks
так вот
moving at the backdrop
исследовать, потому что так видно,
of this movie, and this is a very interesting way
твердо
of
уверен, что
essentially
у тебя есть
legitimizing the
определенная задача.
aggression.
Начальники народные при поясе носят меч, дабы свидетельствовать тем самым, что им дана власть
Of course, they
соблюдать
show
закон
Putin
божественный.
as
То
like
есть
the
они имеют право на то,
executor of God's
чтобы
will
карать,
regarding the
пресекать земные судьбы и давать возможность человеку события, как лишение жизни. Народ, президент, Бог.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's really funny. Father Fomin summarizes this conversation. What matters is the people, Volke, God, and president. That is the kind of the formula of this biblical theology they try to promote through this movie. And as I said, this biblical theology is really, really dangerous because it can justify Shoah. It can justify any atrocity you can imagine. So that would be my warning and my kind of message.
A very stark warning. Those words in Russian parallel the Nazi Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer. One Reich, one people, one leader.